These days, everyone seems to use the word trauma for every issue they have. I feel bad about something, oh, it's PTSD. I have negative emotions, oh, it's trauma. And while the word trauma seems very, very overused, I would argue it is a bit underused. The issue is just that it's almost always used in the wrong context, because most people don't exactly understand what trauma actually is. Which brings me to the very elaborate question, what the heck is trauma then? Well, let's listen to what Bessel van der Kolk says here.
And trauma is as unreasonable as you can be. That's really at the core of, if you understand trauma, is that your brain and perceptual system gets rewired, so you see things almost entirely through the past experience rather than current experience.
Trauma rewires your brain in a way that you see current events from the light of past events. Well, what does that mean? Imagine you are a small child, 6 years old, and you are in school, you sit in your class, and then you want to answer something, you raise your hand, you say the answer, and it's wrong. In fact, it's so wrong that everybody in class starts laughing at you. This, in the moment, is very emotionally overwhelming, because as a small 6-year-old, you don't have a huge capacity of what the world is yet. In fact, for you, the world is the class. That's basically, essentially, almost your whole world. So everybody laughing at you brings up a lot of negative emotions and is emotionally overwhelming. What your brain does now is it ingrains safety lessons. For example, don't speak up in front of others or you will feel emotional pain. Now imagine a few years later as an adult, you are about to hold a presentation in front of your colleagues or whatever it is, and you're about to stand up and hold your presentation, but your heart starts beating faster, you maybe start sweating a little bit, you get very nervous. Why? Because your subconscious connects you holding the presentation back to the past event from when you spoke up in class and everybody started laughing at you. So what your subconscious does now as an adult, it brings up anxiety to prevent you from being in the same situation again, from feeling the same emotional pain again. Of course, your colleagues will most likely not start laughing at you, but your subconscious does not know that. It just tries to prevent you from experiencing emotional pain. So you see the current situation from the light of the past. That's one example of how past events shape our current reality and our lives. And in the most cases, you are not consciously aware of that. It's fully subconscious, like I said. At least I didn't think, oh, when I was 6 years old, back in class, everybody started laughing at me. So this is why my brain now brings up anxiety when I am about to hold this presentation. Not saying that this was me or happened to me, of course. Well, yeah, it did. It basically happened to everybody. Or am I just weird? Anyway, the point is it all happens subconsciously. And the 3 biggest takeaways here are: trauma can be ingrained in emotionally overwhelming situations. You are not consciously aware of how trauma influences you. And at its core, trauma is a safety mechanism to keep you away from perceived danger. Let's have a deeper look into the first point. What are emotionally overwhelming situations? Well, the first things that come to mind when someone says trauma is a war veteran, or maybe a car accident, or any other huge event like that. And while this, of course, can be very traumatic, the most important thing is how you perceive something in the moment and can deal with your emotions in the moment. If the emotions are overwhelming, too much for you to process in the moment or shortly after, they may stay stuck within you and may become traumatic. But actually most traumas happen when we are small children. If you look at point 3 again, at its core, trauma is a safety mechanism to keep you away from perceived danger. It's obvious why. As small children, our brain is still developing a lot, and it tries to understand what the world is, and most importantly, how to keep us safe and alive in the world. So everything that's emotionally overwhelming and perceived as potentially dangerous ingrains very, very deeply in your subconscious. Why? Because your brain needs to figure out how to keep you safe. So when the safety lesson is don't speak up in front of people or everybody starts laughing, this could mean that you potentially get excluded from the tribe, so to speak, if you have a low standing and everybody laughs at you. So your brain automatically tries to not let that happen. This is just how we are wired as social animals. And again, as small children, many situations can be emotionally overwhelming relatively fast. So yes, very small things can potentially lead to big traumatic issues.
I'm wondering if there's a lot of people listening now that I'm trying to understand if their small experience, which other people think is trivial, actually could have resulted in some kind of deeper trauma response.
Absolutely. At the end, the issue is the perception.
Your perception.
Your perception. The issue is not the event itself. You and I may have the same event happening. And for me, it reminds me about my brother torturing me, or it reminds me about my mom being sick and not paying attention to me or whatever. And for me, it becomes a very big deal. And for you, it goes like, yeah.
It may seem trivial from an adult's perspective, but it's all about perception in the moment. For example, I had a client once and we regressed back to a situation when she was maybe 1 year old or something like that. And she was laying in her bed and she started screaming and crying. And her mother did not come. Well, at least not right away. Her mother came eventually. But she was there in her bed crying, screaming, and nobody came. And her brain perceived it as a potentially life-threatening situation because she feared that she was abandoned, that nobody will come and help her. And of course, as a small child, you cannot survive on your own. So her mother coming very late, relatively speaking very late, in her perception it was very late, caused her to ingrain very deep subconscious wounds that caused her later in life to develop very, very strong attachment issues that we dealt with and then resolved. But in that moment, her mother not coming right away, but only a few moments too late or a few moments after, ingrains this deep subconscious issue within her. Now, I'm not saying everybody ingrains trauma because of situations like this. It's always individually different, but something like this can potentially be enough to ingrain deeper traumatic wounds within you. So you can really see how seemingly trivial and small things can have a tremendous impact on our entire life. Things that you don't even know about in almost all cases. Another huge problem can be when as a child you live in an unstable family situation and there are no clear rules and everything is unpredictable. Listen to Bessel van der Kolk here.
That things were predictable is very important. My parents also were predictable, which is enormously helpful for at least for you to anticipate, to know what you are supposed to do, etc., etc. Chaos is a terrible thing.
I think that point is really interesting because although I was physically punished a lot, it was predictable.
Yeah.
So I knew that and I understood why I was being punished. So I was playing football in the house and broke ornaments.
Yeah.
Or something like that. It was never unpredictable.
Right.
The most important thing here is not necessarily the punishment, but the predictability. If you can predict, oh yes, if I fuck up this, I will get punished like that, then you know what's going to happen. There are clear rules. If you cannot predict when punishment is going to happen, you live in a constant state of fear. You don't know what's going on. You might get punished at every second for anything that you may do. So you're basically in a constant state of survival. And obviously this can lead to huge issues later on in life. One very common thing that I also have seen with a few clients is the inability to express emotions. Just because as children they were punished for emotions. So their subconscious, their brain naturally started to repress these emotions, and as adults they cannot express emotions anymore. And in the worst case, he couldn't even tell what emotion he was feeling because he never properly learned how to distinguish between the different emotions. I don't know about you, but the thought that seemingly small and trivial things from my childhood that I don't even know about influence my entire life, influence who I am as a person, is both fascinating and very, very scary. But what can you do now if you struggle in your life? Well, one huge issue is that modern therapy often does not properly focus on you and on getting to the root cause and resolving the issues at their core, just as Bessel Kolk says here.
But the problem is, again, we go back to where we started before the microphone was on, is that our focus these days is on productivity and behavioral change, and not in how do we find out how to help you.
Very often the focus is on productivity and not on the real issue. So if you have been in therapy for years and you don't feel like you've really made any progress, unfortunately, that's not uncommon. I had a client and she was in therapy for 14 years. And she felt like she did not make any progress at all. She had more understanding about her issues and why she was dealing with what she was dealing with, but she still had the same issues. I'm not saying therapy cannot be helpful, it for sure can, but if you feel like you have been stuck for years now, maybe it's time to change your approach. So let's talk about two methods here that are very effective in resolving traumatic issues. The first one, which Bessel Kolk talks about as well, is EMDR.
Somebody starts telling me about EMDR and I don't believe a word of it. And they say, just you move your fingers in front of people's eyes. I mean, you move your eye from side to side as you relive the trauma. And I go, that's crazy. Everybody who hears it, that's crazy. And then people start doing it and they show me how it works. I go like, wow. And people indeed had a certain subsample of people we studied, indeed, after a few sessions of EMDR, go like, yeah, that really sucked, but it's over. It belongs to the past. It's not happening right now.
Yes, EMDR can be very powerful when it comes to processing deeper traumatic issues. One of the main theories behind it is that when we sleep during the REM phase, so the rapid eye movement phase when we dream, this is when emotional processing happens. That's not a theory, that's a fact. So during the REM phase is when emotional processing happens, and what we do now with EMDR is that we mimic the eye movement that happens during the REM sleep, so that emotional processing can take place. And with EMDR, we are doing that in a very directed way while you recall and walk through your traumatic issue.
Most people we see have early childhood trauma, which is much more complicated to treat.
Early childhood trauma is much more sort of stubborn and resistant to this treatment.
Yeah, because your early childhood experiences create who you are.
The second method, hypnosis, is what I mainly use to help my clients resolve traumatic issues. And the trauma my clients deal with almost always goes back to early childhood issues. And in my experience, hypnosis is the most powerful and effective technique to deal with these kind of issues, because you can regress directly back into the situation and handle it, resolve it exactly where it started. And then you can basically install new, better, more empowering safety rules and lessons after letting go of the old ones. If you want to learn more about that and how that exactly works, be sure to check out the video right over there.